Hi, well, this is a short screencast for Independent Colleges Dublin for CIMA E2 for November 2014. And in this particular screencast, we're just looking at some common themes within CIMA E2 that you'll see if you look through, carefully look through the past papers on CIMA's website. Now, I've set them up in terms of batches of 5. This is part 1. And this first part, really, I'm talking in the first instance about strategy formulation for number 1 in this area of the rational approach. Quite a common exam topic, not least in section A, but also in section B. So, in terms of how the examiner comes at this, really, I think what we need to know is we need to know the steps of the rational approach. We need to know that obviously we're setting up a mission and a vision first, flowing through to a corporate appraisal of some kind, and then through to sort of implementation. So that ACI model analysis, choice and implementation, it's important that you have a grip on that diagram and how the rational approach works. But more often than not, he doesn't go in that route. He goes in the route of advantages and disadvantages. So a typical scenario will be that perhaps the rational approach is being used within an organization, and one or other senior board members perhaps are looking to move in another direction, possibly towards the emergent approach. So really what we need to know is the key sort of advantages and disadvantages associated with the rational approach, and perhaps the emergent approach, and you could generally reverse them to get the answer there. So what you've got to be familiar with is obviously Johnson and Scholes associated with the rational approach and their key set of steps on that ACI model, and obviously with the emergent approach, just the key definition, strategy being crafted over time and being the result of sort of planned and unplanned strategies. Some planned strategies will remain unrealized. So we're really talking about crafting as per Mintzberg versus this sort of quite long-winded approach, which involves analyzing the environment and really trying to predict or forecast matters. You may well be familiar or remember Galbraith's definition in relation to forecasting there. Okay. So that's the first thing. Second one is just again quite a common topic that I've seen many times, and I guess in the first instance we need to be able to define culture. So we're either going to use Handy's definition or indeed Hofstede's definition, and I think there's a number of ways that the examiner can and has come at this area of culture. I think the most obvious one really is this area of what impacts upon the culture of a given organization, and we saw that recently within the E2 mock exam. So we're talking about things like the founder, the size of the organization, perhaps the environment, the history, etc., etc. Another way that the examiner could come at that outside of us having to define culture is really to look at sort of national dimensions, and that's where Hofstede's theories will come in, just this idea of different types of national culture. So the definitions of, for example, masculinity versus femininity, this idea of power distance and uncertainty avoidance, I think those are important areas too. Okay. One other question that I've seen in this area is certainly the consequences of different types of culture and perhaps the difficulties associated with strong culture. So watch out for companies who are really moving from perhaps one state to another, or you'll see within one of the screencasts we have a company with a strong culture looking to merge, and the examiner is asking what are the downsides for that company, what are the problem areas, and it's certainly difficult to change a strong culture that's embedded in the organization, so that may cause problems in terms of perhaps merging with another entity or indeed change in any way, shape or form. Okay. Next one I've chosen is a model. Certainly the models are very, very popular as topics, not necessarily coming up every sitting, but I would say every other sitting or thereabout, you'll get one or two of these models thrown in. So this first one I've chosen is the old classic Porter's Diamond, and we'll be familiar with Porter's Diamond and what he talks about in terms of national competitive advantage. So really what we're saying there is there are a set of determinants, four determinants, including factor and demand conditions, etc. I'm sure that you will have learned those by now. So really those four determinants and really the key buzzwords associated with each of those determinants. So for example, under demand conditions, that word sophistication, in other words, the sophistication of the demand rather than the volume of it is key, and really what the company or indeed companies learn from their customers, that really drives innovation. It drives the standards and the quality. So, if Porter's Diamond does come up, aside from us having to have rote learn those key elements, those four elements, and obviously the two outside as well, government intervention and chance events, it's really applying that diamond and those elements to the scenario that you're given. And there will be various hints within the scenario that you should be able to pick up. So, best way to do that is to deal with each determined in order, obviously, list them, possibly use them as headings, and just carefully pick out what the little triggers are, the little prompts that the examiner is giving you. Okay. Next area here is sort of a standalone area, as I've mentioned on the screencast in relation to TCT, transaction cost theory, often an area that students don't understand or avoid. It's not overly complex. So, how would he combat this? Well, I think there's only one real way that he's going to come at this, and I think that's must revolve around costs or transaction costs. But before that, obviously, a definition of what TCT is, and simply it's a way of looking at how business exists, how they organize themselves vis-a-vis that sort of make or buy decision. Keywords in there obviously are that hierarchical versus market approach. Now, in terms of the cost, or outside of defining hierarchy and market, what we've got to do is identify costs, or being able to list costs, and the obvious ones obviously are monitoring the arrangement with the outside supplier through that market approach, fulfillment costs, possible legal costs, costs of drawing up the contract, penalty costs, etc., etc. So the examiner would expect you, perhaps by maybe giving you some items within the scenario, or just expect you offhand to be able to mention that series of transaction costs that are likely to be involved with a business going that sort of outsourcing or market route. Okay. Next one, number 5 here, is again a very, very popular one. Certainly as popular as number 2, culture, conflict, and perhaps the reason this is popular is because conflict is inevitable. Conflict is very, very common in business. I'm sure you've seen it yourself. So in terms of how we could come at this, probably a little bit sort of shorter in terms of volume than the area of culture. I think the main way is that you'd be required to perhaps outline what conflict is. We know that it's a clash of opposing forces, or a clash of groups that have perhaps different goals, different views, different outlooks. And over and above that, I think that important to remember that it can be positive and negative, or constructive and destructive. I would have thought the main way that the examiner would come at this, as you've probably seen within your exam kit, is this area of several different groups and conflict on several different points, and simply asking you to pick them out. So as I see, in terms of a structure and answer, outside of a definition and a little bit of an intro on what conflict is, and the good side, the bad side, perhaps asking you to look at a scenario and identify different areas of conflict under the headings of horizontal and vertical. Okay, so be familiar with those phrases. Obviously, we know that horizontal is really same level, and vertical is different levels. And again, you'll see a screencast available to you within Moodle that shows you how to deal with that type of question. So that's the first 5. Hopefully that's been helpful. Not so much predictions, just my take on what tends to come up on a fairly regular basis. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. Good luck with your studies.